Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce called her when she restocked the trauma bay at 2 in the morning, moving with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed the same task 10,000 times before. He didn't say it to her face. He said it to the resident trailing behind him, gesturing dismissively at Laura Bennett as she aligned sterile instruments in descending size order on the stainless steel tray. His voice carried the particular cruelty of a man who assumed invisibility meant deafness. Laura didn't look up. She didn't pause. She simply continued arranging the 14-gauge angiocath needles in their plastic sleeves, each one placed with the accuracy of a surgeon preparing for war. She had learned long ago that acknowledgement was ammunition. In Seattle General's fluorescent-lit corridors at 3 in the morning, when the night shift moved like ghosts through pale green walls that smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, invisibility was not a weakness. It was a weapon she had spent 18 years perfecting. The hospital hummed around her, the ventilator in room for 12 wheezing its mechanical rhythm, the heart monitor in 418 beeping its steady reassurance, the ice machine clattering down on the 3rd floor. Sounds she could navigate blindfolded. Sounds that meant life and death and everything the world didn't see. Laura moved through Seattle General in San Antonio the way she moved through everything now, as if her body was running on a frequency only she could hear. Her scrubs were the color of faded blue denim, worn soft from 100 washings, with a small pen clip to the pocket. On her left forearm, barely visible unless the light caught it at the right angle, was a pale scar that ran from her wrist to her elbow. The kind of scar that came from a field thoracotomy performed with a combat knife under mortar fire in Tikrit, Iraq, in a place that officially didn't exist on any map. The scar was muscle memory made visible. The scar was the story the world would never hear. Dr. Pierce clicked past her on expensive shoes, the kind that cost more than Laura made in a month, and she felt his presence the way animals feel a shift in barometric pressure. His shoes were Italian leather. His watch was a Rolex Submariner, the gold one that cost $12,000 retail. His confidence was the kind that came from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. He was reviewing a tablet as he walked, his jaw tight, his eyes moving with the focused attention of a man calculating threats. He was also, though he had no idea, terrified. Laura could smell it underneath the cologne, a faint tang of cortisol and desperation that told her everything. Fear smelled like copper and sweat. It was one of the things they didn't teach you in nursing school. It was one of the things you learned in Tikrit. She had noticed the supply room logs 3 weeks ago. Dr. Pierce logged in after hours, 2:33 a.m. on Tuesdays, 3:15 a.m. on Fridays, accessing the inventory management system with credentials that shouldn't have granted him that level of access. A resident's password, if Laura was reading the metadata correctly, which she always did. Small details. The kind of details that kept people alive. The kind of details that got people killed. She had said nothing to anyone. She had documented the access times in her personal notebook in a cipher she had learned from a staff sergeant named Marcus Webb in 2009, and she kept the notebook in her locker underneath her spare scrubs and the folded flag from Webb's funeral. The flag was pressed flat in a cardboard box that had moved with her through 3 cities and 4 hospitals. She touched it every time she opened her locker, the way some people touched a cross or a photograph. It was a ritual. It was penance. It was the last thing Webb had asked her to carry out of the desert. The night shift ended at 7. Laura signed out her patients to the day crew, Mrs. Chen in 402 with a pneumonia that was clearing nicely, Mr. Rodriguez in 405 whose blood pressure was stabilizing, the John Doe in ICU who had been intubated since yesterday and probably wouldn't make it to Friday. She reported each one with the same careful attention, the same measured tone, the same absence of emotion that had kept her alive in the 7th Battalion, 3rd Infantry's area of operations for 18 consecutive months. The day nurse, a woman named Sarah who was good at her job and better at not asking questions, took each report with the respect she reserved for people she sensed had seen things. Sarah had only been a nurse for 4 years. Laura could see it in the way her eyes still had hope in them. By 8 in the morning, Laura was driving home to the apartment she rented on Oakmorn Drive, a 2-bedroom that faced away from the street so nobody could watch her windows. She parked in the back lot, the spot where her car was least visible from the road. She had chosen the apartment for its sightlines and its exits and its proximity to the military medical facility that still maintained some classified protocols she technically shouldn't have access to anymore. The tectonics of her life had shifted the day they told her she was dead. Officially dead. The operation in Tikrit had been classified so deeply that the military couldn't acknowledge she had ever been there, which meant they couldn't acknowledge that she had survived it. Captain Laura Bennett of the 75th Ranger Regiment Support Company had become Laura Bennett, RN, floating between night shifts and rental apartments, invisible to everyone who might have once known her. The government had erased her with the same precision she applied to her medical charting. Efficient. Clean. Final. She made coffee and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop. The apartment was spare: a couch, a bed, a kitchen table, the boxes she hadn't bothered unpacking because there was no point to permanence. In Tikrit, permanence had gotten 314 people killed. She pulled up the hospital supply system using the login credentials she wasn't supposed to have anymore: legacy access, a computer administrator's mistake from 2019, something she had never reported because she was waiting to understand why she might need it. The inventory log showed the discrepancies clearly. Equipment ordered through the hospital supply chain was being billed at 4 times its cost. Surgical drapes that cost $30 were being invoiced at $120. Endotracheal tubes that came in bulk for $8 a unit were being processed through a subsidiary company called Northgate Medical Solutions and billed at $40 each. The pattern was systematic. Methodical. The kind of pattern that indicated someone with administrative knowledge and deep institutional access. The kind of pattern that indicated Dr. Pierce. She closed the laptop and drank her coffee black, the same way she had drunk it in the field, in the darkness before dawn, before the mortars started coming in. The coffee tasted like survival. It tasted like the reason she had never reported the access credentials. She had been waiting to understand the scope of what was happening. Waiting to understand what she was protecting by staying silent. Now she understood. Dr. Pierce was running a kickback scheme through his own supply company, funneling hospital money into invoices for equipment that cost a fraction of what was being billed. The money was going somewhere. The money always went somewhere. What Laura needed to understand was whether the hospital administration knew, or whether they were going to, and which outcome would get her killed first. She showered and slept for 3 hours, the way soldiers slept, light, alert, ready to move in seconds. When her phone alarm vibrated at noon, she was awake before the sound registered. She checked the hospital email on her personal device. Night shift was calling in 4 new admissions: a GSW from San Antonio Police Department South Sector, a motorcycle accident with possible internal bleeding, an elderly woman with severe pneumonia, and a 4-star General James Morrison, transferred from Brooke Army Medical Center with complications from a decade-old shrapnel injury that had suddenly decided to start killing him. A 4-star general. Green Beret, according to the medical summary. Combat history spanning the entire post-9/11 era. Laura read the transfer paperwork 3 times. The classified markers embedded in his admission codes triggered something in her chest, a frequency she hadn't heard in 8 years, not since she had been officially declared dead. His file indicated field trauma protocols, which meant someone had flagged him as a potential complex case requiring experience with battlefield medicine. Someone had flagged him as the kind of patient who would need someone like her. She reported for her shift at 7 p.m., moving through the emergency department doors into the controlled chaos of a busy Tuesday night. The ICU had been cleared to accept 1 critical admission. General Morrison was scheduled to arrive by helicopter, a 20-minute flight from Brooke Army Medical Center in Fort Sam Houston, just across San Antonio, the kind of flight that meant someone important was sick enough to risk the publicity. Laura helped prepare the bed, stocking the monitors with 4 lines and blood products, positioning the monitors for optimal visibility, ensuring the crash cart was positioned 3 steps away with the defibrillator pads already open. Routine work. The kind of work that didn't require her brain. Her brain was somewhere else, somewhere in the past, somewhere in Tikrit where a field surgeon named Captain Marcus Webb had whispered her call sign in the darkness, Nightingale 6, the last thing he said before the bleeding stopped and everything went quiet. The helicopter arrived at 8:51 p.m., and the rotor wash shook the windows on the third floor. General Morrison was rolled into the trauma bay on a stretcher, his body moving with the careful precision of trained personnel who understood that he was held together by luck and sutures and the kind of medical miracles that happened once every 5 years. He was in his 60s, with white hair and a face that had seen command, the kind of face that didn't flinch at crisis. He was conscious and alert, his eye scanning the room with the assessment of a tactical officer evaluating terrain. When those eyes met Laura's, something shifted. He was looking at her the way you look at a person you recognize but can't quite place. The way you look at a ghost. The conference room at Seattle General smelled like coffee and antiseptic, the kind of controlled clinical sterility that made Laura's skin tighten every time she stepped inside for grand rounds. 23 residents sat in ascending rows of tiered seating, their white coats pressed sharp as knife edges, their attention focused on the projection screen where Dr. Pierce stood with a red laser pointer in his hand. That pointer moved across the screen like a weapon. Laura sat in the back row, her own charting displayed in 24-point font for everyone to dissect. This, Dr. Pierce announced, circling a section of documentation with a laser, is what happens when nursing becomes about box-checking rather than critical thinking. His voice carried the smooth confidence of a man who had never been questioned in his life. The residents leaned forward, some of them scribbling notes, others exchanging glances that made the air feel thin. Nurse Bennett here has documented every vital sign. Every medication. Every patient complaint. He paused for effect, turning to face the room. But where's the clinical judgment? Where's the narrative? This is the work of someone who learned medicine from a manual rather than from patient care. A few residents smirked. One whispered something to the attending physician beside him. The laser pointer continued its circuit around Laura's words on the screen, dissecting her documentation like it was evidence of incompetence rather than precision. Dr. Pierce stepped closer to the projection, his shadow falling across the image. We cannot afford this level of superficiality in this hospital. We cannot afford nurses who do not think, who merely document and move on to the next patient without understanding the deeper clinical picture. Laura met his gaze across the conference room. Her jaw didn't clench. Her hands didn't tremble. She simply held his eyes with a flat, cold stare that made something shift in his expression, a hesitation, a crack in his performance. The laser pointer wavered. Dr. Pierce's mouth opened, then closed. The silence stretched like pulled taffy, uncomfortable and sticky, and for 3 seconds nobody in that room breathed. Then Laura spoke. Her voice was quiet enough that every resident leaned forward to hear it, which meant her words carried across the sterile space with the precision of a scalpel strike. You spent 3 minutes on my documentation and 6 years building a medical supply contract that bills Medicare for equipment this hospital never received. She stood, gathered her notes, turned and walked out while the room went dead silent, the kind of silence that happens when someone speaks the truth in a place built on lies. Dr. Pierce's face flushed, a deep angry red that started at his jawline and spread upward like a stain. He opened his mouth to respond, found no words, and closed it again. One of the attending physicians looked away. Another stared at the projection screen as if the answer might materialize in the pixels. The hallway outside the conference room was empty except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of a code being called in the trauma bay. Laura didn't slow her pace. She didn't acknowledge the way her hands were moving, steady as surgical lasers, precise and measured, completely under control. That was the thing about military training that Dr. Pierce would never understand. The trembling wasn't fear. The trembling was restraint. And she had spent 14 years learning to hold it. 2 hours later, during her afternoon break, Laura stood at the vending machine on the 3rd floor with her badge clipped to her scrubs and her mind already moving through the evening patient roster. She was reaching for a coffee when she heard footsteps approaching from the direction of the administrative corridor. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She knew the gait, the breathing pattern, the particular way Dr. Pierce displaced the air around him like something that didn't belong in normal atmospheric pressure. Nurse Bennett. His voice carried across the hallway loud enough for passing staff to hear. Loud enough for a surgical resident rounding the corner to slow his pace and pretend not to listen. Your attitude problem is now a formal disciplinary issue. If you can't follow basic protocols without questioning your superiors, security will escort you out of this facility immediately. He positioned himself between her and the exit, a tactic that made the space feel smaller, more predatory. Laura selected her coffee from the machine. The cup dropped into the dispenser with a mechanical thud. She waited for the pour to finish, watching the steam rise in a thin column toward the ceiling, then turned to face him. "I followed the protocol you wrote, Doctor." Her voice was steady, almost conversational. The one that requires nurses to report billing irregularities to administration within 72 hours. She took her coffee and walked past him, her shoulder nearly brushing his jacket. That was the moment something crystallized in Dr. Pierce's face, a recognition that the woman he had been trying to humiliate, the nurse he had publicly dissected in grand rounds, was not going to break. Was not going to retreat. Was not going to apologize or cry or beg. She was simply going to walk away while he stood there with nothing but his authority and his lies, and authority means nothing to someone who has already lost everything that matters. That evening, Dr. Pierce began making phone calls from his office on the administrative floor. His voice was smooth, practiced, the tone of a man expressing genuine concern about a difficult employee. He called the chief of nursing first, his words carefully measured. "I've noticed some concerning patterns in Nurse Bennett's documentation over the past few weeks. Patient safety issues, I think. Nothing dramatic, but the kind of thing that creates liability." He paused, let that sink in. "And her attitude in grand rounds today, the insubordination, it suggests a deeper problem with respecting the physician-nurse hierarchy. Then the hospital administrator. Then the head of HR. Each call built a narrative brick by brick, a structure of reasonable concerns and documented irregularities that existed nowhere but in his construction. He mentioned patient safety. He mentioned hostile workplace environment. He mentioned how her presence on the unit created tension, how her questioning of procedures undermined physician authority, how her obvious resentment of the medical hierarchy made her a liability risk. By the time he hung up the phone after the third call, he had built a case so airtight that the only question was how quickly they could process her termination. But that night, something arrived at Seattle General that changed the trajectory of everything. The 4-star general came by helicopter, the kind of arrival that meant classified markers and military protocol, and the kind of patient care that required every specialist in a 50-mile radius to suddenly be available. Green Beret, the medical transfer papers said. 72 years old. Combat injury sustained in theater, now complicated by shrapnel migration and internal bleeding that civilian surgeons were hesitant to touch without military clearance. The rotor wash shook the windows in the ER bay as they brought him in, his call sign listed in the admission notes with the kind of security classification that made even the hospital administrator step carefully around the details. Laura received the assignment at change of shift. Room for 08. New admission, critical condition, require continuous monitoring and careful documentation. She gathered her supplies and her clipboard and made her way down the corridor with the same measured pace she used for everything, her mind already cataloging the equipment she would need, the monitoring parameters, the baseline assessments. Then she opened the door to room for 08 and stopped. The general was unconscious, his face lined with the kind of exhaustion that comes from surviving things that shouldn't be survivable. But it was his chart that made her stillness absolute. Name. Rank. Service record. Unit designation. Commanding officer of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. The man who sent her own son into the firefight in Tikrit 6 years ago. The man whose orders came back with her son in pieces, not dead, thank God, not dead, but wheeled out of a transport helicopter with shrapnel embedded in his femur and a TBI that still woke him screaming at 3 in the morning. She didn't call for the nurse manager. She didn't request a transfer. She entered the room and began her assessment with steady hands, checking 4 lines and monitoring equipment, documenting vitals with the kind of meticulous precision that Dr. Pierce had mocked in grand rounds. Pain is information. Pain is data. The anger that wanted to surface, the fury of seeing the man responsible for her son suffering lying unconscious in a hospital bed, pain was just information that her training had already processed and filed away years ago. The general's son, Captain Michael Morrison, was recovering 3 doors down in room for 11. A Green Beret captain himself, following his father into service the way sons sometimes do, carrying the same impossible standards and the same unshakable sense of duty. When Laura checked on him that evening and mentioned the arrival of his father, something shifted in the young captain's face, a vulnerability that never showed during rounds, a moment where the uniform didn't matter and he was just a son hoping his father would survive. He's critical but stable, Laura told him. The surgical team is evaluating him now. They're being careful. Michael nodded, his jaw tight. My father's the kind of man who survives things other people don't. That night, the hospital called for rare blood type donors. AB negative. Urgent need. The blood bank was putting out a general call, and Laura was in the hallway when she heard the announcement. She didn't pause to think about why she was volunteering. She didn't examine the decision. She simply walked to the donation center on the main floor, sat in the comfortable reclining chair, and watched her blood flow into collection bags while a phlebotomist made cheerful conversation about the importance of donation. By tomorrow morning, the general would have her blood running through his veins. By tomorrow morning, she would have made a choice that Dr. Pierce would interpret as a violation, an inappropriate emotional involvement, a boundary that a professional nurse should not cross. But what the hospital didn't know, what Dr. Pierce didn't understand, was that Laura had been crossing boundaries and breaking protocols in service of something larger than hospital policy for 14 years. She had held perimeters in Tikrit for 11 hours with nothing but a combat knife and the refusal to let 7 men die on her watch. She had carried out a fallen teammate in her medic pack under enemy fire. She had received commendations written in classified language and then been ordered to forget they existed. This blood donation was nothing. This blood donation was mercy. Dr. Pierce saw her name on the donor list the next morning and made a note in his personal file with methodical precision, inappropriate emotional involvement with patient care. Donated blood to military VIP. Potential boundary violation. He began drafting a reassignment order, moving Laura to the parking garage medical station where she would be isolated from the main hospital, unable to observe anything, unable to ask questions, unable to pose any threat to his supply chain operations or his carefully constructed narrative about her incompetence. The reassignment order was drafted by 2:02 p.m. By 3:15 p.m., it would be signed by the chief of nursing. By tomorrow morning, Laura Bennett would be a parking garage nurse, invisible in a way she had never wanted to be, separated from the critical patients who actually mattered, pushed to the margins of the hospital where she could be quietly, efficiently terminated without anyone asking inconvenient questions. But in room for 08, the 4-star general was beginning to stabilize. His vital signs were improving. His blood pressure, which had been in the 70s when he arrived, was now climbing steadily with each unit of blood. 2 units. 3 units. Then Laura's blood entered the 4 line, and something in the general's condition shifted subtly, a strengthening, a resilience, something that the monitors couldn't quite quantify but that experienced nurses could sense in the way a patient's body responded to treatment. Laura checked the 4 flow rate, noted the improvement, and documented it with the same precision she documented everything. The monitor beeped its mechanical warning, steady at first, then accelerating into a rhythm that made the fluorescent light seem to flicker in sync. Laura stood at the nursing station, reviewing the general's labs from the evening drawer, when the trend line punched her in the chest, hemoglobin dropping faster than the transfusion could replace it. 8.2. 7.9. 7.4. The blood she donated 4 hours ago was already flowing through his veins, and it wasn't enough. Internal bleeding. Somewhere behind his ribs, in the dark cavity of his abdomen, vessels were opening and closing like mouths, and he was drowning from the inside. She pulled his chart, fingers moving with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before, in tents and hums and field hospitals where the difference between reading numbers and reading the silence behind them meant someone walked out or didn't. The general's BP was 118/72 at midnight. Now, at 3:47 in the morning, it read 93/58 and trending downward like a jet losing altitude. His heart rate had climbed to 132, compensating, trying to push blood through a system that was hemorrhaging faster than medicine could calculate. The surgical resident, a nervous kid named Patterson who'd been on call for 18 hours, was sleeping in the on-call room upstairs. The attending surgeon lived in the suburbs, a 30-minute drive from Seattle General under ideal conditions. It was 4 in the morning. The roads were empty. That meant 23 minutes if he broke speed limits. Possibly 20. The general had maybe 15. Laura moved without deciding to move. Her hands were already reaching for the crash cart, already checking the defibrillator pads, already knowing the protocol that would fail. She paged Patterson, code blue, room 408, and the moment her finger left the call button, the monitors began their escalating wail. The ventilator wheezed its rhythm unchanged, indifferent to catastrophe, while the cardiac monitor displayed a pattern that made her jaw clench once, sharply, then release. Atrial fibrillation. The heart was panicking. The body knew it was dying. She was moving toward the room when Dr. Pierce appeared in the corridor like he'd materialized from the wall itself, his white coat unbuttoned, his face carrying that particular expression of controlled authority that made junior residents flinch. Behind him, Patterson shuffled, still pulling his scrub cap over his hair, eyes unfocused with that particular glaze of someone woken from deep sleep who hasn't yet remembered where they are. The nursing staff was converging, 2 respiratory therapists, the night shift charge nurse, and for specialist with the practiced calmness of someone who'd been starting lines in chaos for 14 years. The general's monitor screamed. Laura reached the bedside first. Room 408 smelled like antiseptic and the copper metallic tang of blood, that specific scent that meant something was wrong at a cellular level, that the body's boundaries were failing. The old man's skin had taken on that particular shade of grey that wasn't quite a colour, that was the absence of colour, and his eyes were moving behind closed lids with the restless quality of someone drowning in real time. His right foreline had infiltrated, the tissue around the catheter was swelling, puffy and pale, useless. She had one working line, and the transfusion bags were running dry. She was already calling for a second 18 gauge, already thinking 3 steps ahead, when Dr. Pierce stepped into her space. "Step back, Nurse Bennett." Not a request. Command sounded different. They had weight. They had the texture of authority that assumed obedience the way gravity assumes objects fall. Laura didn't move. The general's blood pressure fell to 87/44. She could taste the copper of her own blood where her teeth pressed into her lower lip. "The surgeon is en route," Dr. Pierce said, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone repeating something he'd already explained. "We maintain supportive care until arrival. That's protocol. That's how we do things here. You do understand protocol, don't you, Nurse Bennett, or do you have another problem with the way this hospital operates?" The words landed the way they were meant to land, with the sharp edge of the disciplinary review, the termination case he'd been building, the subtle reminder that she was already on borrowed time. Patterson had reached the bedside now, his hands shaking as he checked the 4 lines. The charge nurse was positioning 2 residents on either side of the patient, and Dr. Pierce was moving with the fluid certainty of someone who understood the room, the hierarchy, the invisible lines of power that determined who made decisions and whose hands remained still. He turned to Patterson, his voice dropping into the tone of instruction. "Maintain current supportive care only. Aggressive fluids, continue the transfusion. We wait for Dr. Holloway." Patterson nodded, his face the color of the wall behind him. The monitor's wail became a steady shriek. The general's oxygen saturation was dropping, 98%, 96, 94, and Laura was standing at the threshold of the room, absolutely motionless, her hands at her sides with a stillness that felt like violence. Muscle memory was a living thing. It had its own voice, its own language, and it was screaming at her with the urgency of every field operation she'd ever run. Every moment her hands had been the difference between a soldier walking out and a body going home. She could feel it in her palms, the phantom weight of scissors and gauze, the weight of decisions made in seconds, the weight of a responsibility that no floor nurse at Seattle General was supposed to carry. Dr. Pierce turned to face her, and something in his expression shifted, a calculation, a moment of understanding that she was still standing there, still watching the monitors, still thinking in the language of triage and hemorrhage control. He positioned his body between her and the bedside like a goalkeeper, like someone who had just understood that the real threat in the room wasn't the failing patient, it was the nurse with the steady hands and the eyes that tracked vital signs like they were reading coordinates. "You're already under review," he said quietly, and the words carried the particular menace of someone using institutional power like a weapon. "One more insubordination and you're done. Security will remove you if necessary. Do you understand me?" The general's BP dropped to 79/38. Laura met his gaze, and whatever he saw in her face made him take half a step back, almost imperceptibly, almost as if he hadn't moved at all. She didn't speak. The silence stretched like a held breath, and in that silence, she understood something she'd been trying not to understand, that this moment, this calculation, this decision to block her from the bedside wasn't about protocol or procedure or anything that could be written in the hospital bylaws. It was about fear. He understood that if the patient died without intervention, he had tragedy and the tragic statistics that came with it. If she intervened and succeeded, her competence became impossible to bury, impossible to explain away with disciplinary paperwork and whispered conversations with administration allies. And if she intervened and failed, he had a termination case wrapped in a patient death, criminal liability charges perhaps, ammunition he could use forever. So he was choosing to let the general die rather than let Laura save him. The thought came with a clarity that felt like cold water, and she held herself absolutely still, feeling the weight of the decision, feeling the particular ache of understanding exactly what kind of man stood between her and her responsibility. Patterson had stepped back, his hands empty, his eyes moving from the general to Dr. Pierce to the monitor with the panicked quality of a resident who understood something was very wrong but couldn't quite articulate what. The general's son appeared in the adjacent doorway then, still connected to his own fall line, his face carrying that particular expression of someone who'd just woken to the sound of alarms and understood that the man in the next room was dying. "What's happening? Why are the alarms?" "Everything possible is being done," Dr. Pierce said, his voice dropping into the professional calm of a man making a statement for the record. "Your father is receiving the best care available. The surgeon is en route and should arrive within 20 minutes. The general's heart rate climbed to 144. His oxygen saturation fell to 88%. The monitor beeped its warning, steady and relentless, and Laura stood in the doorway with her hands at her sides and watched the numbers descend like a countdown to a moment she had trained her entire life to prevent and was about to be ordered not to. The weight of her service record felt like armor and like chains, like the classified clearance that meant she couldn't speak to a single person in this hospital about what she actually was, like the folded flag hidden in her locker that came from a soldier who'd relied on her hands and wasn't coming home because she'd been 3 seconds too late. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was understanding that Dr. Pierce was counting on her to break, to challenge him, to give him the grounds he needed to have her removed, to clear the room of her presence before she could do something he couldn't control. And she understood, with the particular clarity that comes from a lifetime of calculations under pressure, that the only move she had available was the one that would cost her everything, to stand there, to do nothing, to let the general's vital signs plummet into a range where even divine intervention wouldn't matter, and then to move. But first, she waited for the order. She waited for Dr. Pierce to commit to the decision. She waited for the moment when his authority became absolute and irrevocable, when the option for mercy became impossible. Because there was a difference between being a nurse following protocols and being a nurse defying them. One could be explained. One could be forgiven. One would cost her the career she'd built and the anonymity she'd earned with blood and silence. The other would cost a 4-star general his life. She was still waiting when the monitor's rhythm became a single long note of flat line, and Patterson's hands finally moved toward the crash cart. The general's monitor flatlined. One long note of cardiac arrest that cut through everything, the ventilator's wheeze, the whisper of 4 pumps, the soft click of Dr. Pierce's shoes backing away from the bedside. Patterson's hands moved toward the crash cart, but Laura was already moving. 3 strides across the room, her body crossing the space between observation and action like muscle memory recognizing an old language. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for the on-call surgeon who was still 23 minutes away. The general had perhaps 8 minutes before irreversible brain death took root. Betadine, sterile field, retractors, chest tube kit. Now. Her voice wasn't loud. It was the kind of quiet that cuts through chaos because it carries the weight of someone who has given orders under mortar fire. The resident scrambled, not because she had authority written on her badge, but because her tone contained certainty that transcended protocol. A young resident in his 3rd year of training moved on pure muscle memory from anatomy labs and simulation training, his hands reaching for supplies before his conscious mind caught up. Another resident cleared the bedside table, moving the monitor aside, creating a sterile field with the speed of people responding to someone who clearly knew what she was doing. Dr. Pierce grabbed her arm. "Bennett, step back. Now." "You don't have." But Laura was already gloved. Already positioned. Already making the incision with a sterile scalpel along the 5th intercostal space, the blade moving with the precision of someone whose hands had learned their trade in a dust-covered aid station in Tikrit, not in a sterile American hospital. The skin parted. The muscles beneath separated. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators, each motion economical, each decision final. This wasn't hesitation. This wasn't learning. This was muscle memory, pure and weaponized, the kind that lives in bone and sinew and doesn't require permission from administrative protocols. The retractor went in. A resident on either side, pulling back the chest wall to expose the cavity beneath. Blood. Dark and urgent. The general's left ventricle had ruptured, the bleeding vessel visible now, stark against the pale tissue surrounding it. Laura's hands didn't shake. The trembling that might have been present in another person was replaced by something harder, colder, the kind of surgical focus that comes from understanding that hesitation kills faster than any wound. Satin sky clamp. Vascular clamp. Now. The resident placed it in her palm without speaking. Laura's hand moved. The bleeding vessel clamped. Stopped. The bright red arterial flow ceased as if someone had simply turned off a faucet. Her fingers moved across the damaged tissue, assessing, calculating, her hands wrist-deep in the general's open chest cavity while stunned residents held the retractors and Dr. Pierce stood frozen in the doorway, watching his termination case resolve itself through pure competence. The suction cleared the field. Blood-stained gauze. The cavity became visible. Laura worked with the economical motion of someone closing wounds in conditions where electricity might fail and time was ammunition. Ligatures. Careful closure. Each layer of tissue returned to its place, vessels tied off, the chest wall sealed with the precision of a craftsperson who understood that imprecision was a death sentence. Her hands moved like she was operating by emergency floodlight in a fire-base aid station, not under the bright fluorescence of a Seattle General Trauma Bay. The on-call surgeon arrived to find her finishing the final sutures. Dr. Reeves from cardiothoracic, already in a coat and running, stopped in the doorway as he registered what he was seeing, a night shift nurse, apparently unauthorized, closing a patient's open chest cavity with the technical precision of someone trained at the very highest level of emergency medicine. For one moment, the only sound was the beep of monitors stabilizing, the soft hiss of the ventilator, the ragged breathing of everyone in the room who had just watched a patient return from cardiac arrest without a defibrillator, without ACLS, without protocol. The general's O2 sat climbed. 78, 82, 88, sinus rhythm. Beautiful, perfect, regular sinus rhythm. Then Dr. Pierce moved. His voice came from the doorway, tight with controlled fury that barely masked something closer to panic. Emergency board review. Immediately. This nurse just performed surgery without authorization, without supervision, in direct violation of her scope of practice and my explicit orders. Patient endangerment. Reckless behavior. She's a liability this hospital cannot afford. He didn't wait for responses. He pulled his phone from his pocket before he even left the trauma bay. 3 calls in the hallway. 1 to the chief of medicine. 1 to the hospital's legal counsel. One to an administrator Laura had never heard of, someone with the kind of institutional weight that made decision-making disappear into conference rooms where no one had to defend their reasoning. 2 days later, Laura walked to the bus stop in cold rain, her cardboard box held against her chest like something that might break. Inside, a cracked mug from the ER lounge, a succulent plant that had stopped being green approximately 3 months ago, a photograph of her son in dress uniform from before the firefight that sent him home in pieces. These were the pieces of a life she'd been ordered to bury twice. The first time in Tikrit when she'd been written out of official records and erased into classified files. The second time now, in San Antonio, carrying a box that contained everything she was allowed to keep from her existence as Captain Laura Bennett, night shift nurse, competent invisible woman. The termination letter had been surgical in its precision. An authorized performance of surgical procedures outside her licensure scope. Patient endangerment. Violation of direct physician orders. The words Dr. Pierce had crafted seemed designed not just to justify her termination but to ensure that no other hospital in Texas would touch her with a contract if they ran her references. Rain hammered the bus shelter roof like applause for a show nobody watched. Laura stood beneath it, water dripping from her hair, her scrubs soaked, her cardboard box growing soft at the corners. The street ahead showed taillights retreating in the downpour. A car passed and threw water across the curb. She watched it without registering it, her mind already somewhere else, calculating severance, understanding that her security clearance probably meant she'd be hearing from people other than HR within 48 hours, recognizing that the general's presence in that hospital had been no accident and his survival had been no accident either. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was inside the box, at the bottom beneath the cracked mug and the dying succulent and the photograph of her son. A folded flag. American flag, 3 by 5, pressed into perfect triangles the way they fold them at funerals. Her medic pack from Tikrit. She'd carried it out in her hands, that flag, after Jenkins bought it in the Jolin district trying to reach for a civilian kid who was probably already gone. She'd carried that flag in her field pack through 3 years of classified assignment, and now she was carrying it in a cardboard box to a bus stop in the rain where nobody knew she'd ever been anything except a nurse that Dr. Pierce had needed gone. The bus pulled up, diesel engine idling, door hissing open. She climbed aboard with the box, found a seat near the back, and pressed her forehead against the window. The city rolled past, lights blurred by rain, and somewhere in the towers of Seattle General, Dr. Pierce was probably pouring himself something expensive, congratulating himself on eliminating a threat that had cost him exactly nothing except a phone call and the right administrators on speed dial. 3 days later, Laura's phone rang. Unknown number. The kind of call she'd been trained to recognize but never expected to receive again. Captain Bennett? This is Brigadier General Morrison's office. You're being summoned back to Seattle General. Room for 08. Bring your dress uniform, if you still have it. She didn't ask how they got her number. She didn't ask how they knew her rank. She already knew the answer: paperwork. A routine background check that the hospital's HR department had run for her termination file. A classified security clearance that was buried so deep in Pentagon archives that it was supposed to stay buried forever, except that someone in a room full of flags and 4 stars had raised an eyebrow at her name and pulled a file that was supposed to be sealed. Dr. Pierce's phone call started at 11 p.m. and didn't stop until dawn broke gray and ugly over San Antonio. He worked from his office with the door locked, the kind of lock that made the evening janitor skip that floor. One administrator owed him a favor from a consulting contract. Another had a daughter applying to medical school and knew that Pierce's letter of recommendation could open doors or slam them shut. A third simply understood that hospitals protected their own when the right kind of pressure was applied in the right kind of way. By 3 a.m., it was done. Laura Bennett would be reassigned to the parking garage med station, the supply office, technically, but everyone called it exile. 12 hours a day managing inventory, entering data, her hands kept away from patients, her competence locked in a supply closet with expired gauze and broken equipment. He made the reassignment official by 6 a.m., before the hospital woke up. Before anyone could ask why a trauma-certified critical care nurse was suddenly counting bedpans. But reassignment wasn't enough. Dr. Pierce understood that thorough destruction required layers. On the second day, he had her computer access restricted, no patient records, no charting system, no way to argue her case through documentation. He called IT personally and used the word security concern 3 times in a way that made IT director understand this wasn't a request. On the third day, he met with the chief nursing officer in a hallway where no one was watching, speaking low about Laura's concerning pattern of boundary violations and inappropriate attachment to high-profile patients. He had a narrative ready: a nurse who had donated blood to a patient, a nurse who had intervened in a procedure outside her scope, a nurse whose judgment was compromised by something that looked an awful lot like obsession. He filed incident reports that were technically accurate but spiritually dishonest, cherry-picking moments to construct a portrait of someone unstable, someone dangerous. By Friday, it was all there in her personnel file, a paper trail leading inevitably toward termination. The rain came down on Monday afternoon like judgment. Laura stood at the bus stop on the edge of the parking lot, a cardboard box balanced against her ribs. The kind of box they gave you when you were done, when the security badge had been surrendered and the locker had been emptied. Inside was her cracked coffee mug, the one with the faded logo from a VA hospital in D.C. A dying succulent that hadn't seen sunlight in 2 weeks. A photograph of her son in dress uniform, 19 years old, smiling like he didn't know yet that Tikrit would ask him for pieces of himself he'd never get back. The rain soaked through her jacket, ran down her neck, dripped from her hair onto the cardboard until the box began to soften at the edges. Waiting for a bus that was running 12 minutes late. 2,694 days since she'd walked out of that classified briefing room with orders to cease existing. 3 years of being invisible. 3 days of being visible for exactly the wrong reasons. The bus pulled up with the hiss of air brakes and the smell of diesel exhaust mixing with rain on hot asphalt, a smell that always reminded her of rotor wash and combat boots and the precise moment when being alive became a choice instead of a guarantee. At the bottom of the box, beneath the incident report she would never be allowed to dispute, sat a folded flag. Not the kind presented at funerals, though she'd received one of those too. This one was smaller, field-folded, the kind you carried out of a war zone when there was no one else to carry it. Sergeant Marcus Webb. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. Killed in action, Tikrit, 2019. She had held his hand as the morphine took effect. She had whispered to him that the evacuation bird was coming, that his wife was going to be okay, that his daughter was going to grow up knowing he was brave. She had lied about the evacuation bird. The evacuation bird wasn't coming. What was coming was that moment, 11 hours later, when she stood over his body and realized the flag would need to come home with someone, and no one else was looking. So she'd folded it with the reverence it deserved and placed it in her medic pack next to the field trauma shears and the combat tourniquet and the morphine she'd used on 7 other men who would live, because Marcus Webb had bought them that time. All of it, the box, the photo, the flag, the sodden cardboard slowly dissolving in the rain, was supposed to stay buried. Orders from a general. A classification stamp that said this never happened. A new identity that was supposed to last for the rest of her life. The bus doors hissed open. Laura stepped inside, carrying the only pieces of herself she was allowed to keep. But that wasn't the only action unfolding that Monday. In a room on the 6th floor of the Pentagon, a routine background check had been flagged by an automated system that had learned to recognize patterns in classified clearance records. Laura Bennett's file was sealed with a top-secret // no-fawn classification that should have stayed sealed. Except that someone had updated the seal status when she'd been hired at Seattle General, routine procedure, standard security, the kind of administrative task that no one paid attention to. Except the system had noticed. It always noticed. The flag had triggered a notification to a 4-star general named Morrison, the same general lying in Seattle General's intensive care unit, the same general who had given the order that classified her out of existence. The same general whose blood type had been AB negative, the same rare type that Laura carried in her veins. The same general whose son had been fighting beside Laura in that firefight in Tikrit, the same son who had come home still breathing because she had held that perimeter for 11 hours. The notification sat on General Morrison's secure server, red and pulsing, until his deputy director read it and understood what it meant. A classified operative. A combat medic. A woman who had been officially erased and was now working in a civilian hospital under her real name. An operational security breach. An opportunity. 3 days later, a Marine colonel walked into Laura's apartment without knocking, the way military protocol allowed when there was no other way. He was dressed in dress uniform, his ribbons a catalogue of places the world tried to forget. He carried a folder and a silence that had weight. He sat across from her at the kitchen table where she was staring at nothing, the cardboard box broken down and stacked by the door, and he said 4 words, "The general wants you." Not wants. Needs. The general is asking. The general is commanding. The classification had been lifted, partially, ceremonially, enough for what was about to happen. Laura drove back to Seattle General that afternoon in a car that suddenly felt like it was traveling backward through time. The general was awake. That was the first thing Laura saw. His eyes had focus, consciousness, the kind of clarity that meant the bleeding had stopped and the transfusions had held and her rare blood had done the work it was supposed to do. He stared at her as she stepped through the door, and his eyes said what his mouth couldn't quite manage at first. Nightingale 6. His voice was rough from intubation, soft from morphine, but absolutely certain. The call sign she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 3 years. The designation that was supposed to stay classified. The name that connected her to Tikrit and the perimeter and the 7 men and the 11 hours and everything she'd been ordered to forget. Sir. The rank came automatically. The Marine colonel stepped forward with a document folder and he began to read. Not from the file, from memory. He knew this citation by heart. For extraordinary heroism in combat operations conducted in Tikrit, Iraq, on June 14, 2019. A medic codenamed Nightingale 6 held a defensive perimeter under sustained automatic weapons fire for 11 hours and 47 minutes, treating casualties while simultaneously providing return fire and coordinating evacuation protocols. 7 personnel who sustained life-threatening injuries were successfully evacuated due to the extraordinary actions and professional competence of the above-named individual. 1 personnel was brought out KIA for proper burial honors, which would not have occurred if not for the medic's refusal to abandon the perimeter. The individual's selflessness and tactical awareness prevented additional casualties and maintained unit cohesion under impossible circumstances. The colonel's voice didn't waver. His eyes didn't leave Laura's face, watching for the moment when 3 years of invisibility began to crack. The door burst open and Dr. Pierce was there, his face the color of processed meat, his voice high and tight with the sound of a man watching his entire life cave in. She needs to be removed from the premises immediately. Security, now. His phone was already in his hand, already dialing, already reaching for the last shred of institutional authority he possessed. But the general was struggling to sit upright, tubes catching and pulling, his monitor alarm starting to sing. His eyes were on Laura, on the combat medical badge scar barely visible above her collar, the mark of combat medicine service, the mark of someone who had done things that required official acknowledgement. Captain, the general said. Not nurse. Not her. Captain. The rank she'd buried. The identity she'd been told to abandon. Your call, Captain. That was when Dr. Pierce understood. That was when his face went white instead of red, when his mouth stopped moving, when he realized that the investigation he'd launched to justify her firing had been escalated, had been intercepted, had been examined by federal auditors who had discovered that his supply contracts were fraudulent, that his kickback schemes were extensive, that his carefully constructed life of consulting fees and lake house payments was built on Medicare fraud that had paid for every comfort he possessed. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Pierce. The worst part came 6 months later. Laura stood in the same corridor where Dr. Pierce had humiliated her during grand rounds. The same hallway. The same fluorescent lights that hummed like dying insects. But now she wore the dress uniform that had been officially reissued by the Department of Defense, the captain's insignia on her shoulder, the ribbons on her chest, the combat medical badge that had no longer been classified into silence. Her security clearance had been reactivated by Pentagon authorization. Her personnel file had been cleared by federal investigators. Her termination had been reversed not by the hospital but by the federal government, which understood that sometimes military service didn't end just because someone put on scrubs. The hospital had assembled staff in the main conference room. The general, still recovering but strong enough to stand with assistance from a cane and sheer force of will, walked in beside her. His son, Captain David Morrison, Army Ranger, Purple Heart recipient, newly promoted, stood in dress uniform beside his father. And Laura's own son sat in the front row in his wheelchair, the one that held him since the IED in Helmand Province had taken his legs and almost taken his will, and he watched his mother the way people watch someone who has finally stepped into light. The Marine Colonel read the full citation, no longer classified, no longer buried, no longer pretending it had never happened. 11 hours. 7 men. 1 flag. The perimeter. Tikrit. The choice to stay when staying meant dying, and the choice to live when living meant carrying that decision forever. When it was done, General Morrison, still general, still commander, still the man who had given the order that erased her 3 years ago, raised his hand in a salute. He pinned the soldier's medal on her uniform with hands that had healed enough to shake, and he spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. Laura returned the salute, her eyes meeting her son's across the room, and for the first time in 3 years, she stood in full light. Outside, through the conference room windows, a medical supply van pulled away from the loading dock, its driver wearing a work uniform with the company logo emblazoned across the back. No one watched it leave. No one was looking anymore. Hit like if this story got you. And tell me, have you ever been underestimated at work, only to prove them all wrong? I read every comment. Subscribe if you haven't already.